In the depths of space, where empires rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a truth that the galaxy's most powerful civilizations refuse to acknowledge. They made a catastrophic mistake 5 centuries ago. They thought they had broken humanity. They were wrong. When the great warships of the Zephyrian Empire descended upon Earth, they expected to find another primitive species ripe for conquest. What they discovered instead was a race that fought with such ferocity, such unrelenting determination, that it took the combined might of 7 alien civilizations to finally subdue them. Even then, victory came at a price so steep that the survivors whispered of humans as the demons from the blue world. But demons, as the galaxy would soon learn, are not so easily caged. Marcus Chen, the last known human, has spent 500 years in the deepest prison pits of Krillian Prime, his body broken but his spirit burning like a star on the edge of collapse. The aliens believe they have won, that the human threat has been neutralized forever. They celebrate their triumph while using Marcus as a living trophy, a reminder of their greatest conquest. They have no idea that their greatest mistake was keeping him alive, for in the shadows of the galaxy, ancient powers stir. The Drakmori, beings of scales and flame that predate every known civilization, have been sleeping in the void between stars. Their awakening will shatter the delicate balance that has kept the galaxy's tyrants in power for centuries. And when chaos comes calling, when the very foundations of galactic civilization crumble, there will be only one species with the audacity, the sheer bloody-minded stubbornness to stand against the dark. Humanity may have lost the war, but the real battle is just beginning. This is the story of how one man's unbreakable will ignite a revolution that would reshape the stars themselves. This is the story of why you never, ever write off the human race. Welcome to humanity's second chance. Marcus Chen opened his eyes to the familiar symphony of agony that greeted him every morning for the past 500 years. The neural dampeners embedded in his spine sent waves of controlled pain through his nervous system, a reminder to his alien captors that even after half a millennium, they still feared what he represented. He lay on the cold metal floor of his cell, listening to the distant hum of the prison's energy barriers and the occasional skittering of maintenance drones in the corridors beyond. The cell measured exactly 3 meters by 3 meters by 3 meters. He had counted the rivets in the walls during his first decade of imprisonment, memorized every scratch and stain during his second. By his 3rd century, he had begun carving microscopic marks into the metal with his fingernails, creating a calendar that only he could read. The aliens had tried to stop him, but Marcus had discovered long ago that human determination was a force that could wear down even quantum-reinforced steel. The morning routine never varied. At precisely 0600 Standard Galactic Time, the cell's illumination panels would flicker to life, bathing everything in harsh white light. The food dispenser would hiss, depositing a gray, nutrient-rich paste onto a small tray that emerged from the wall. The waste recycling unit would activate with a low whir, and Marcus would begin another day of existing in defiance of every law of probability and alien expectation. Today, however, something was different. The usual cacophony of sounds from the upper levels of the prison was absent. No footsteps echoed in the corridors. No voices carried through the ventilation system. Even the ever-present hum of the facility's massive power generator seemed subdued, as if the entire structure was holding its breath. Marcus sat up slowly, his joints protesting after 5 centuries of intermittent torture and inadequate nutrition. The aliens had done their best to keep him weak, but they had underestimated the human body's capacity for adaptation. Where others would have died, Marcus had evolved. Where others would have broken, he had become something harder than the metal that contained him. He moved to the small window that offered the only view from his cell. It was barely large enough for his face, designed more as psychological torture than genuine transparency. Through it, he could see a small section of Krillian Prime's courtyard, where alien guards typically conducted their patrol routes with mechanical precision. The courtyard was empty. More concerning still was the sky. The familiar purple-tinged atmosphere of Krillian Prime was streaked with something that looked suspiciously like smoke. In the distance, what appeared to be flashes of light painted the horizon in brilliant oranges and reds. Either the prison was experiencing technical difficulties on a massive scale, or something significant was happening beyond these walls. Marcus pressed his ear against the cell door, a thick barrier of reinforced durasteel that had contained him for longer than most civilizations had existed. Through it, he could hear something that made his pulse quicken for the first time in decades. Chaos. There were distant explosions, the unmistakable whine of energy weapons, and beneath it all, a sound he had not heard since the fall of Earth. Screaming, not the controlled clinical screaming of torture sessions or prisoner discipline, but the raw primal terror of people facing something they could not comprehend or control. The neural dampeners in his spine pulsed more aggressively. The pain was excruciating, but Marcus had long ago learned to transform suffering into fuel. Every surge of agony reminded him of who he was, what he had lost, and why he continued to draw breath when any reasonable person would have given up centuries ago. He was Marcus Chen, former captain of the Earth Defense Force, the last living veteran of the Battle of Luna Station, and the sole survivor of humanity's final stand against the Zephyrian Empire. He was 43 years old chronologically, though the alien life extension treatments had kept his body frozen at peak physical condition. They wanted him to live forever, an eternal trophy of their greatest victory. The irony was that they had created their own worst nightmare. A new sound penetrated the prison's walls, something that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was a roar, deep and resonant, carrying undertones that spoke of age and power beyond mortal comprehension. He had heard similar sounds during his military service when Earth's forces had encountered some of the galaxy's more primitive species. But this was different. This was the sound of something that predated the current galactic order entirely. The lights in his cell flickered. Then they went out completely. Emergency illumination bathed the corridor beyond his door in pulsing red light. Somewhere in the distance, an alarm began to wail, its pitch climbing higher and higher until it became almost unbearable. The prison's automated systems were activating protocols that Marcus had never heard before, not even during prisoner riots or security breaches. Through the small window, he watched as shapes moved across the courtyard. They were too large to be any of the alien species he was familiar with, moving with a fluid grace that suggested natural predators rather than civilized beings. One passed directly beneath his window, and Marcus caught a glimpse of scales that gleamed like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed with an inner fire. Dragons. The word came to him unbidden, drawn from humanity's oldest myths and legends. But these were not the fantasy creatures of Earth's stories. These were something far more terrible and magnificent, beings that radiated power like a physical force. As he watched, one of them turned its massive head toward his window, and for a moment, their eyes met. The creature's gaze was ancient and knowing, carrying within it the weight of eons and the wisdom of species that had risen and fallen before the current galactic civilizations had even discovered fire. There was intelligence there, vast and alien, but also something else, something that might have been recognition. The dragon held his gaze for several seconds before turning away, its attention drawn by approaching footsteps. Marcus watched as a squad of Krillian guards rounded the corner, their plasma rifles charged and ready. They moved with the professional confidence of soldiers who had faced every conceivable threat the galaxy could produce. They were completely unprepared for what they encountered. The dragon moved with impossible speed for something so large. One moment it was standing motionless in the courtyard, the next it was among the guards like a force of nature made manifest. Plasma bolts struck its hide and dissipated harmlessly. Claws longer than Marcus's forearm swept through armor as if it were paper. In less than 10 seconds, the entire squad was reduced to scattered remains. But the dragon did not feed on the fallen guards as Marcus might have expected. Instead, it lifted its head toward the upper levels of the prison and released another of those bone-deep roars. This one was different from the first, carrying within it what sounded almost like language, a call to others of its kind. It was answered. From every direction came similar roars, creating a cacophony that shook the very foundations of the prison. Through his window, Marcus could see more of the creatures emerging from what appeared to be nowhere, materializing out of shadows and empty air as if they existed partially outside normal space-time. They moved through the facility with purpose, not randomly destroying but methodically dismantling the prison's defenses. The cell door behind him hissed, and Marcus turned to see sparks flying from its locking mechanism. The prison's automated systems were failing one by one, unable to cope with whatever was happening outside. After a moment that stretched into eternity, he heard the distinctive click of magnetic locks disengaging. For the first time in 500 years, Marcus Chen was free. He stood in the doorway of his cell, breathing air that did not taste of recycled atmosphere and metal walls. The corridor beyond stretched in both directions, lined with hundreds of similar cells. Most remained sealed, their occupants likely unaware that their eternal imprisonment might be coming to an end. But scattered throughout the hallway were other open doors, and from them emerged figures that Marcus had not seen in centuries. Other prisoners. Other survivors of species that had dared to challenge the galactic order and paid the ultimate price for their defiance. They moved cautiously, their bodies bearing the marks of long captivity, their eyes holding the same hollow look that Marcus recognized from his own reflection in the polished metal surfaces of his cell. Among them, he spotted what might have been a Tyraxian warrior, its chitinous exoskeleton scarred from decades of torture, a Vroth engineer, its 6 arms trembling from neural conditioning. Temperature, several beings he could not identify, their species perhaps extinct save for these final representatives. They all shared one thing in common. They had been deemed too dangerous to kill, but too valuable to waste. They were living trophies, proof of the Galactic Empire's power over those who would dare resist. Now they were free, and freedom was a dangerous thing to give to people who had nothing left to lose. Marcus began walking down the corridor, his bare feet silent on the metal floor. The other prisoners watched him pass, some with curiosity, others with the wariness of predators recognizing a fellow apex hunter. He had no weapons, no armor, no resources beyond the clothes on his back and 5 centuries of accumulated rage. It would have to be enough. Behind him, the roars of dragons continued to echo through the prison's halls. Ahead, the corridor branched into multiple passages, each leading deeper into the facility's heart. Somewhere in this maze of metal and misery were the prison's command centers, its armories, its communication arrays, and somewhere beyond that lay the wider galaxy, unaware that its carefully maintained order was about to face a reckoning 500 years in the making. Marcus Chen, the last human, began to run, not in fear or panic, but with the controlled urgency of a soldier who had finally found his war again. The neural dampeners in his spine screamed their protests, flooding his system with agony designed to bring him to his knees. He kept running anyway because that was what humans did. They endured. They adapted. They survived. And most importantly, they remembered. The prison's layout had been burned into Marcus's memory during his first century of captivity. Every corridor, every junction, every security checkpoint had been cataloged and stored in his mind through careful observation and patient deduction. The aliens had never realized that their living trophy was conducting his own intelligence-gathering operation, mapping their Stronghold 1 overheard conversation and glimpsed maintenance route at a time. He moved through the facility with purpose, avoiding the main thoroughfares where automated defense systems still functioned. The dragons were magnificent in their destruction, but they were also drawing all of the prison's remaining security forces toward the outer levels. That left the inner corridors relatively unguarded, an oversight that Marcus intended to exploit. The other escaped prisoners had scattered in different directions, each following their own agenda. The Tyraxian had headed toward what Marcus knew to be the communications center, likely hoping to contact surviving members of its species. The Vroth engineer had disappeared into the maintenance tunnels, probably seeking the power distribution nodes that kept the facility operational. They were all thinking tactically, but they were thinking like individuals. Marcus was thinking like a human. The armory lay 3 levels down and 2 sections over from his former cell. It would be heavily defended under normal circumstances, but these were far from normal circumstances. As he descended through emergency stairwells and service corridors, the sounds of battle grew more intense. The dragons were not simply destroying the prison, they were fighting something. Energy weapons discharged in rapid sequence, followed by roars of pain and rage that shook dust from the ceiling tiles. Whatever was happening outside had drawn reinforcements from somewhere, and they were putting up more resistance than the initial guard units had managed. Marcus paused at a junction where two corridors met, pressing himself against the wall as footsteps approached from around the corner. A moment later, 3 Krillian guards rushed past, their weapons drawn and their breathing rapid with fear. They moved like soldiers who were retreating from something they could not comprehend, their usual disciplined formation abandoned in favor of simple speed. One of them was wounded, blue blood seeping through the cracks in his armor. As they passed Marcus's hiding spot, he caught fragments of their conversation in the clicking, whistling language of their species. Most of it was too rapid and fear-distorted for him to follow, but certain words stood out. Words like Ancient Ones and Death from the Void and The Prophecy Fulfilled. That last phrase made Marcus's skin crawl. In his experience, when alien civilizations started talking about prophecies being fulfilled, it usually meant that someone's carefully laid plans were about to intersect with forces beyond their control or understanding. The dragons were clearly not random attackers. They were here for a specific purpose, and their timing suggested coordination with something larger. After the guards had passed, Marcus continued his descent toward the armory. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows, making the familiar corridors seem alien and threatening. Several times he had to step over the remains of guards who had encountered the dragons, their bodies torn apart with surgical precision. The creatures were not feeding on their victims, which suggested that this was warfare rather than hunting. That raised uncomfortable questions about what exactly the dragons wanted from this place. The armory's blast doors had been sealed when the emergency protocols activated, but Marcus had watched maintenance crews override them during his captivity. The manual controls were hidden behind a panel marked with Krillian warning symbols, protected by a biometric scanner that required administrative access. Under normal circumstances, that would have been an insurmountable obstacle. These were not normal circumstances. The scanner had been damaged by whatever force had knocked out the prison's primary power grid. Sparks flew from its housing as Marcus examined the exposed circuitry beneath. 500 years of observing alien technology had given him an unusual education in xenoengineering, and he could see where the power surge had overloaded the security protocols. Using a piece of metal debris from a nearby wall panel, he carefully short-circuited the scanner's primary control matrix. The blast doors shuddered, their magnetic locks disengaging with a grinding screech that echoed through the corridor. After a moment of protest, they began to slide apart, revealing the treasure trove beyond. The Krillian prison armory contained weapons from dozens of civilizations, trophies taken from defeated enemies and dangerous technologies confiscated from prisoners over the centuries. Plasma rifles lined the walls in neat rows, their power cells charged and ready. Energy swords hung from magnetic racks, their blades humming with contained force. Armor suits stood like silent sentinels waiting for warriors to give them purpose. And in the center of it all, displayed like a religious relic, hung a single piece of equipment that made Marcus's heart skip a beat. Human military gear. It was his gear salvaged from the wreckage of his command ship during the final battle for Earth's orbital defense platforms. The black composite armor was scarred from plasma impacts and close combat, its surface marked with the insignia of the Earth Defense Force. The rifle that hung beside it was a standard-issue EDF pulse weapon, its barrel etched with kill marks that Marcus himself had carved during the war. They had kept it as a trophy, a reminder of their greatest victory over humanity's finest soldiers. The irony was that they had preserved it better than any museum could have, maintaining its functionality through regular maintenance and careful storage. Marcus stripped off his prison clothes and began donning the armor, muscle memory guiding his hands through routines he had practiced 10,000 times before his capture. The suit's internal systems came online as he sealed the helmet, displaying tactical information on the heads-up display and establishing connection with the rifle's targeting computer. After 5 centuries of forced nakedness and vulnerability, he felt whole again. The transformation was more than physical. With each piece of equipment he secured, Marcus could feel himself changing from prisoner to predator. The neural dampener still functioned, still sent waves of agony through his nervous system, but the armor's medical systems began administering counteragents that dulled their effectiveness. For the first time in centuries, he could think clearly without the constant distraction of artificially induced pain. He was dangerous before. Now he was terrifying. As he checked the rifle's power cell and confirmed its weapon systems were operational, Marcus heard new sounds echoing through the armory's entrance. Not the roars of dragons or the screams of guards, but something that made his blood run cold. Marching feet moving in perfect synchronization. The distinctive whine of heavy-energy weapons powering up. The mechanical clicking of automated targeting systems acquiring locks. The prison's reinforcements had arrived, and they were bringing serious firepower. Marcus moved to the armory's surveillance console, activating the external cameras that monitored the facility's various levels. What he saw on the screens confirmed his worst fears. The attacking force was no longer just dragons. Arrayed throughout the prison's corridors were beings that belonged to nightmare rather than reality. Tall figures in environmental suits that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it moved alongside the dragons with obvious coordination. Their movements were too fluid to be entirely organic, suggesting cybernetic enhancement or possibly complete artificial construction. They carried weapons that Marcus did not recognize, devices that pulsed with energy patterns unlike anything in the galactic standard arsenal. But most disturbing of all were the creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal space-time. They flickered in and out of visibility, their forms shifting between solid matter and something that looked like controlled entropy. When they moved, reality itself seemed to bend around them, creating distortions that the surveillance equipment could barely capture. This was not a prison break. This was an invasion by forces that predated the current galactic order, beings that had been waiting in the spaces between stars for their moment to return. The dragons were not liberating prisoners out of altruism. They were recruiting soldiers for a war that most civilizations did not even know was coming. Marcus switched the surveillance feed to his old cell block and felt his breath catch in his throat. The corridor where he had spent 5 centuries was now filled with the escaped prisoners, but they were not fleeing or hiding. They were kneeling in submission before one of the shadow-suited figures, their heads bowed in what appeared to be reverence or worship. As he watched, the figure extended what might have been a hand toward each prisoner in turn. Where it touched them, their bodies began to change. The Taraxian's chitinous exoskeleton grew thicker and more angular, developing blade-like protrusions along its arms and back. The Vroth engineer's 6 limbs elongated and multiplied, becoming more tool-like and precise. Other prisoners underwent transformations that were difficult to follow on the grainy surveillance feed. They were being changed, enhanced, prepared for purposes that Marcus could only guess at. The ancient forces that had arrived with the dragons were not content with simple liberation. They were creating an army from the galaxy's most dangerous outcasts and criminals. An army that would inevitably be turned against the civilizations that had imprisoned them. The surveillance console chimed, indicating movement in the corridor outside the armory. Marcus switched to the local cameras and saw 3 figures approaching the blast doors. 2 were dragons, their scales gleaming in the emergency lighting, their eyes focused on his location with unmistakable intelligence. Between them walked one of the shadow-suited beings, its form shifting and unstable like smoke given semi-solid shape. They had come for him specifically. Marcus could have tried to hide, could have looked for another exit or attempted to avoid the confrontation entirely. Instead, he holstered his rifle, sealed his helmet, and walked toward the armory entrance. After 500 years of captivity, he was finally going to meet his liberators face to face. He had questions that needed answering, and he suspected that the conversation was going to be far more complicated than a simple rescue operation. The blast doors finished cycling open just as Marcus reached them. On the other side, the 3 figures stood waiting with obvious patience. Up close, the dragons were even more magnificent than he had expected. Their scales were not simply black, but seemed to contain depths like looking into the space between stars. Their eyes held intelligence that made Marcus feel like an insect being examined by a scientist, but it was the shadow-suited figure that commanded his attention. As he watched, its form solidified slightly, revealing features that were almost but not quite humanoid. Its face was angular and sharp, with eyes that glowed with the same inner fire as the dragon's. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. "Marcus Chen of Earth," it said in perfect, unaccented English. "Last son of humanity, we have waited long for this moment." Marcus kept his rifle lowered but ready, his finger near the trigger guard. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, a gesture that was somehow both alien and familiar. "We are those who came before. Those who watched as the galaxy forgot its history and repeated its mistakes. We are the Drakmori, and we offer you a choice that your species has not had for 5 centuries. The chance to reclaim what was taken from you. The chance to restore balance to a galaxy that has grown corrupt in our absence. The chance to make those who destroyed your world understand what they have truly lost." One of the dragons shifted its weight, and Marcus caught a glimpse of scars along its flank. Battle damage from conflicts that predated recorded history. These were not mindless beasts, but ancient warriors, veterans of wars that had shaped the very structure of galactic civilization. "And in return?" Marcus asked, because in his experience, no one offered anything without expecting payment. The shadow figure's expression might have been a smile, though it was difficult to tell with features that seemed to exist in a constant state of flux. "In return, you become what your species was always meant to be, not the broken remnant of a conquered people, but the harbinger of change that will reshape the stars themselves. You want me to join your army. We want you to lead it." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, carrying implications that Marcus was only beginning to understand. Around him, the prison continued to shake with the sounds of systematic destruction. Above him, the forces that had held the galaxy in an iron grip for centuries were being systematically dismantled by beings they had thought were myths. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, other ancient powers were stirring, drawn by the scent of war and the promise of a galaxy ripe for conquest. Marcus Chen, the last human, stood at the threshold of a decision that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of every civilization that had ever dared to dream of peace among the stars. Marcus stared at the shadow figure for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. Lead an army of ancient beings and transform prisoners against the galactic order that had destroyed humanity. The offer was tempting beyond measure, but 5 centuries of captivity had taught him to look beyond immediate gratification to long-term consequences. "Before I give you an answer," he said finally, "I need to understand what you really are and what this war of yours is actually about." The dragons flanking the Drakmori representative shifted slightly, their massive heads turning toward their companion as if seeking permission to speak. The shadow figure raised what might have been a hand, and the larger of the 2 dragons stepped forward. When it spoke, its voice was like controlled thunder, each word carefully modulated to be comprehensible to Marcus's human hearing. "I am Vorthak the Endless, Herald of the Deep Dark, last of the Prime Clutch. We are not aliens as your species understands the term. We are what came before the current galactic order, before the artificial divisions and false hierarchies that your captors represent. You're saying you're native to this galaxy? Native?" Vorthak's laugh was like distant avalanches. "Young human, we shaped the very stars your enemies worship. We guided the first civilizations from primordial chaos to interstellar awareness. We taught the concepts of honor, justice, and proper warfare to species that had never conceived of anything beyond tribal conflict." The shadow figure stepped forward, its form solidifying further as it spoke. "The current galactic powers are usurpers, Marcus Chen. They arose during our great sleep, when we withdrew to recover from wounds dealt by entities that no longer exist. While we healed, they built their empires on foundations we had laid, claiming our gifts as their own innovations." Marcus processed this information, his tactical mind automatically cataloging the implications. "So this is about reclaiming lost territory? A war of succession?" It is about preventing the destruction of everything we spent millions of years building, the Drakmori replied, its voice carrying undertones of genuine anguish. The current galactic order is not sustainable. It is built on oppression, exploitation, and the systematic elimination of anything that challenges its authority. Your species learned this truth the hard way. The second dragon, smaller but bearing more extensive battle scars, moved closer. The powers that destroyed Earth are symptoms of a deeper corruption. They fear growth, fear change, fear anything that might challenge their static vision of galactic order. In their desire for absolute control, they are strangling the very diversity that makes civilization possible. Marcus thought of Earth, of the billions who had died when the combined fleets of 7 civilizations had reduced humanity's homeworld to radioactive ash. He thought of the systematic genocide that had followed, the hunting down and execution of every human they could find. The aliens had not simply conquered humanity, they had tried to erase it from existence entirely. Why did they fear us so much? He asked, voicing a question that had tormented him for centuries. Vorthak's eyes blazed brighter because humans possess something that the current galactic order has systematically bred out of itself over the millennia. You call it stubbornness, determination, the refusal to accept defeat. We call it the flame imperishable, the spark that drives evolution and progress and change. Every species that has ever achieved true greatness has possessed this flame, the Drakmori added. The Krillians had it once, before they became obsessed with order and control. The Zephyrians possessed it in their early expansion phase, before they decided that conquest was preferable to growth. One by one, the galactic powers have chosen stagnation over development, security over advancement. Humans never made that choice. The smaller dragon continued. Even when faced with overwhelming odds, even when defeat was certain, your species continued to adapt, to innovate, to find new ways forward. That made you dangerous to civilizations that had decided progress was too risky to permit. Marcus understood now why his captors had kept him alive rather than simply executing him. He was not just a trophy, he was a reminder of what they had been forced to destroy to maintain their vision of galactic order. Every time they looked at him, they were confronted with the evidence of their own fear and inadequacy. And now you want me to help you tear it all down? We want you to help us build something better, the shadow figure corrected. The current order will fall regardless of our actions. It is too rigid to adapt to the changes that are coming, too corrupt to reform itself, too weak to defend against the threats that gather beyond the galactic rim. Our choice is not whether to destroy it, but whether to guide its replacement or allow chaos to consume everything. The prison around them shuddered as something massive impacted the outer walls. Through the armory speakers, Marcus could hear the distinctive whine of capital ship weapons firing at close range. The prison's defenders were not just facing the dragons and their allies. They were fighting a full-scale naval engagement in orbit. The Krillian Third Fleet has arrived, Vorthak observed with what might have been satisfaction. Their response time is impressive, though ultimately irrelevant. You have a fleet up there? Marcus asked. We have something better than a fleet, the Drakmori replied. We have allies that the current galactic powers believed were extinct. Races that went into hiding rather than submit to the false order, technologies that were suppressed rather than allowed to flourish. The wraith ships of the Nethys Collective are currently demonstrating why the Krillians were wrong to believe they had eliminated every trace of psionic warfare from the galaxy. As if summoned by the creature's words, new alarms began sounding throughout the prison. These were not the general emergency signals Marcus had heard before, but specific warnings that spoke of threats the facility's designers had never anticipated. The lights flickered in patterns that suggested massive power drains, and the very air seemed to vibrate with energies that existed outside normal electromagnetic spectra. Psionic warfare was banned by Galactic Treaty 3 centuries ago, Marcus said, by a treaty that was imposed on species that had no choice but to accept it or face extinction. The smaller dragon corrected. The Nethys did not agree to abandon their gifts, they simply learned to hide them more effectively. Now they returned to reclaim their place in a galaxy that tried to pretend they never existed. Through the surveillance monitors, Marcus watched as new shapes appeared in the prison's corridors. These were not the solid forms of dragons or the shifting shadows of the Drachmori, but something that seemed to exist primarily as patterns of light and energy. They moved through walls as if they were not there, appearing behind defensive positions to strike at enemies who could not see them coming. The Krillian guards were firing blindly at targets their instruments could not detect, their sophisticated weapons useless against foes that existed partially outside normal space-time. Within minutes, organized resistance throughout the facility began to collapse as the defenders found themselves fighting enemies they could not perceive or predict. "This is just the beginning," the Drachmori said, its voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction. "For too long, the galaxy has been ruled by those who fear progress, who suppress innovation, who eliminate anything that challenges their narrow vision of how civilization should function. That reign of mediocrity ends now." Marcus moved to the surveillance console, cycling through cameras that showed the systematic destruction of everything he had known as reality for the past 5 centuries. The prison that had contained him was being dismantled not through brute force, but through the application of technologies and abilities that the current galactic order had declared impossible. "What happens to the prisoners who don't want to be transformed?" he asked, thinking of the beings he had seen kneeling before the shadow figures.
"They are given the same choice we are offering you,"
Vorthak replied. "Join us willingly and retain your essential identity while gaining the power to reclaim what was taken from you. Refuse and remain as you are, free to leave but with no protection when the old order collapses around you." "And if I refuse your offer specifically?" The Drachmori's form shifted, becoming momentarily more human in appearance before returning to its shadow-like state. "Then you remain Marcus Chen, last human, free to make your own way in a galaxy that will soon be unrecognizable. But know that the chance we offer now will not come again. The transformation we provide can only be given once, and only to those who choose it freely." Marcus understood the implicit threat. The ancient powers were returning whether he joined them or not. The galactic order that had destroyed Earth was going to fall regardless of his decision. His choice was not whether to participate in the coming war, but whether to shape its outcome or simply survive its consequences. The surveillance screen showed the last pockets of resistance being systematically eliminated throughout the prison. The Krillian forces that had seemed so invincible during his captivity were being swept away by enemies they could not comprehend or effectively fight. The carefully maintained order that had defined his existence for 5 centuries was dissolving into chaos. And in that chaos, Marcus could see opportunity. "If I agree to lead your army," he said slowly, "I want certain guarantees. I want to know that innocent civilizations will be protected during the transition. I want assurance that what replaces the current order will be better, not simply different."
"You want to preserve the moral high ground that your species was known for,"
the smaller dragon observed. "Even in the face of genocide and 5 centuries of imprisonment, you seek to limit the damage your revenge might cause."
"I seek to ensure that this war serves a purpose beyond simple destruction,"
Marcus corrected. "Humanity died fighting for something greater than itself. If I'm going to honor that sacrifice, I need to know that our actions will create something worthy of their memory." The Drachmori stepped closer, its form becoming more solid and defined. "That is precisely why you are the leader we need, Marcus Chen. The galaxy does not require another conqueror driven by hatred and ambition. It needs someone who understands that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The choice remains yours," Vorthak added, "but choose quickly. The Krillian reinforcements are mobilizing their primary battle fleet, and our window for extraction is limited. Whatever you decide, it must be decided now." Marcus looked around the armory one final time at the weapons and armor that represented the accumulated military might of a dozen civilizations. Then he looked at the surveillance screens where the last remnants of his prison were being swept away by forces that existed beyond the understanding of those who had held him captive. Finally, he looked at himself, reflected in the polished surface of his helmet's visor. After 500 years of captivity, of pain, of existing as nothing more than a symbol of humanity's defeat, he had the chance to become something more, to reclaim not just his freedom, but his purpose. The decision, when it came, was easier than he had expected. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll lead your army. But we do this my way, with human rules of engagement and human standards for the treatment of civilians and prisoners." The Drakmori's form blazed with sudden brightness, and both dragons raised their massive heads in what might have been salutes of acknowledgement. "Then let us begin your transformation, Marcus Chen," the shadow figure said. "Let us make you into what humanity was always meant to become." The transformation began immediately. Marcus felt it first as a warmth spreading through his chest, different from the artificial heat of his armor's life support systems. This was something organic, something that seemed to resonate with the deepest parts of his cellular structure. The neural dampeners that had tormented him for centuries began to malfunction, their signals growing weaker as something in his nervous system adapted to counteract their effects. "Do not fight it," the Drakmori advised, its voice now carrying undertones that seemed to speak directly to his subconscious mind. "The change we offer does not destroy what you are. It reveals what you have always had the potential to become." The warmth spread outward from his core, flowing through his bloodstream and nervous system like liquid fire. Marcus could feel his body beginning to change at the molecular level, his human physiology adapting and evolving in ways that should have been impossible. His bones grew denser but lighter, his muscles more efficient, his reflexes faster. But more than physical changes, he could sense alterations in his mental capacity, his ability to process information and make tactical decisions expanding exponentially. "The gift we offer has been dormant in humanity since your species first looked up at the stars," Warthek explained, his massive form beginning to glow with the same inner fire that blazed in his eyes. "We planted the seeds long ago, in the earliest days of your evolution. What you call human determination, human creativity, human refusal to accept defeat, these are manifestations of power that your species has barely begun to understand." Through the transformation, Marcus retained his consciousness and his memory, but he could feel his perspective shifting in fundamental ways. The tactical display in his helmet's heads-up system began showing information that should not have been available to its sensors. Energy patterns that revealed the underlying structure of the prison's failing defenses. Probability matrices that predicted the movement of enemies he could not directly observe. Combat algorithms that incorporated variables he had never learned to calculate. "We are not making you into something alien," the smaller dragon said, its voice now carrying harmonics that Marcus could understand on levels beyond simple auditory processing. "We are awakening abilities that were always part of human potential. Your species was designed to be more than it became, but the galaxy's artificial limitations prevented that growth. The physical changes were remarkable but not overwhelming. Marcus found that he could see across broader spectra of light, could hear sounds that had previously been beyond human perception, could sense electromagnetic fields and gravitational anomalies as clearly as temperature or pressure. His reaction time improved by orders of magnitude, his hand-eye coordination becoming superhuman without losing the essential human characteristics that defined his identity. But the mental changes were even more significant. Marcus could feel his consciousness expanding, his ability to hold multiple complex concepts in simultaneous consideration growing exponentially. Strategic planning that would have taken hours now occurred in seconds. Pattern recognition that would have required extensive analysis became intuitive and instantaneous. "This is what humanity would have become if the galactic powers had not intervened," the Drakmori said, its form now blazing with energy that Marcus could perceive across multiple dimensions. "This is why they feared you, why they could not permit your species to reach its full potential. A fully realized human is not simply another advanced alien race. It is something that challenges the very foundations of how civilization organizes itself." Through the surveillance monitors, Marcus watched as the last of the prison's defenses finally collapsed. The Krillian reinforcements that had been rushing to the facility's aid were being systematically destroyed by forces that moved through space in ways that conventional military doctrine could not account for. ships that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, weapons that struck their targets before they were fired, tactics that incorporated elements of space and time as tactical resources. The wraith ships of the Nethys Collective, Vorthak observed, following Marcus's gaze. They learned to fight in dimensions that most species cannot perceive, using abilities that the current galactic order declared illegal and impossible. Now they demonstrate why those declarations were made out of fear rather than wisdom. The transformation was nearing completion, and Marcus could feel the full scope of his new abilities beginning to stabilize. He was still recognizably human, but he was also something more, something that incorporated the best aspects of human nature while transcending the limitations that had previously defined his species' potential. The army you will lead consists of beings like yourself, the Drakmori explained. Not just the transformed prisoners from this facility, but representatives of every species that has been suppressed or eliminated by the current galactic order, races that went into hiding rather than submit, technologies that were suppressed rather than allowed to develop, powers that were declared impossible rather than permitted to flourish. How many? Marcus asked, his voice carrying new harmonics that reflected his enhanced vocal cords. Enough, the smaller dragon replied. The galaxy is vast, and the current powers control only the systems they can actively monitor and suppress. In the spaces between their patrol routes, in the dimensions beyond their perception, in the time streams they cannot access, entire civilizations have been waiting for the moment when resistance becomes possible. Through his enhanced senses, Marcus could perceive the approach of extraction vessels that existed partially outside normal space-time. They moved through the quantum foam between dimensions, their hulls constructed from materials that incorporated principles of physics the galactic powers had never discovered. These were not simply advanced ships, they were expressions of completely different approaches to the relationship between technology and reality. Your first assignment will be to coordinate the liberation of similar facilities throughout this sector, the Drakmori continued. Prisons, research stations, and containment facilities where the galactic powers have stored everything they consider too dangerous to destroy but too valuable to waste. Each contains resources that will prove invaluable in the coming conflict. And after that, Marcus asked, though he was beginning to understand the scope of what he was being asked to undertake. After that, you help us reshape galactic civilization into something worthy of the species it governs. The current order treats diversity as a threat to be eliminated rather than a resource to be cultivated. It values stability over growth, control over innovation, conformity over excellence. That approach has created a galaxy that is slowly strangling itself through its own fear of change. The extraction vessels had arrived, their forms becoming visible through the prison's shattered outer walls. They were beautiful in ways that transcended simple aesthetics, their designs incorporating mathematical principles that spoke to something deep in Marcus's enhanced consciousness. Looking at them, he could understand why the current galactic powers had been so afraid of the technologies they represented. The choice you made commits you to more than simple warfare, Vorthak warned. You will be leading the transformation of galactic civilization itself. The responsibility is enormous, and the consequences of failure extend far beyond the destruction of your enemies. Marcus nodded, understanding the weight of what he had accepted. But for the first time in 5 centuries, he felt capable of bearing that weight. The enhancement he had received was not just physical or mental, it was spiritual, giving him access to reserves of strength and determination that he had not known he possessed. "What about Earth?" he asked. "What about the possibility of restoring humanity as a galactic power?" The Drakmori's form shifted, becoming momentarily more human in appearance. "The Earth you knew is gone, Marcus Chen. The world of your birth exists now only as radioactive debris orbiting a dying star. But the essence of what made humanity special, your creativity, your determination, your refusal to accept artificial limitations, that can be restored and shared with others who possess similar potential. You're talking about creating a new human civilization? I am talking about creating a galactic civilization that embodies the best aspects of human nature," the shadow figure corrected. "Not a human empire, but a community of species that share humanity's commitment to growth, innovation, and the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. Through the extraction vessel's open bays, Marcus could see other transformed beings waiting for him. Former prisoners from facilities throughout the sector, representatives of suppressed races, refugees from civilizations that had been eliminated by the galactic powers. Marcus took his position at the vessel's command station, his enhanced senses immediately integrating with its control systems in ways that should have been impossible. The ship responded to his thoughts as much as his actions, its consciousness merging with his own to create something that was greater than the sum of its parts. "Then let's begin," he said, his voice carrying across communication channels that reached every vessel in the growing fleet. "Let's show the galaxy what humans were meant to be." The extraction vessels departed Krillian Prime in a flash of quantum fire, leaving behind only wreckage and the first signs of a revolution that would reshape the very foundations of galactic civilization. 6 months after his liberation from Krillian Prime, Marcus Chen stood on the command deck of the Prometheus Rising, flagship of what the galactic powers had begun calling the Liberation Fleet. Around him, holographic displays showed the current state of a war that was reshaping the very structure of galactic civilization. Entire sectors had declared independence from the old order, their populations awakening to possibilities they had never been permitted to imagine. The transformation of galactic civilization was proceeding faster than even the Drakmori had anticipated. Species that had accepted subjugation for millennia were discovering that they possessed abilities and potential that the current powers had systematically suppressed. Technologies that had been declared impossible were being developed and deployed with stunning regularity. The rigid hierarchies that had defined galactic politics for centuries were dissolving as new forms of cooperation emerged, but it was not happening without cost. The Zephyrian Empire had responded to the liberation movements by implementing increasingly desperate measures. Entire star systems were being subjected to orbital bombardment rather than permitted to join the growing rebellion. Civilian populations were being relocated to containment facilities that made Marcus's former prison look humane by comparison. The empire that had once prided itself on benevolent rule was revealing the totalitarian core that had always lurked beneath its civilized exterior. "Status report," Marcus requested, his enhanced senses automatically processing data streams from across the fleet. "Liberation operations in the Outer Rim are proceeding ahead of schedule," reported Vexahai, the former Taraxian prisoner who had become his chief tactical officer. The transformation she had undergone had enhanced her natural strategic abilities while preserving the analytical mindset that made her invaluable in complex operations. 17 facilities have been successfully cleared, yielding over 3,000 new recruits and significant technological resources. "The Krillian response has been more aggressive than anticipated," added Zhirin, a Vroth engineer whose 6 arms now incorporated advanced computational matrices that allowed him to interface directly with the fleet's most sophisticated systems. "They've deployed their experimental quantum disruptor weapons against the civilian populations of 3 worlds that declared independence." Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger that accompanied reports of atrocities committed against innocent beings. The neural dampeners that had once channeled that rage into suffering now served as a reminder of what he fought against. The transformation he had undergone included enhanced emotional control, but it did not eliminate his capacity for righteous fury. "Casualty estimates?" he asked. "Approximately 400 million dead across the 3 systems. Vexahai reported, her chitinous features hardening with controlled rage. "The attacks were specifically designed to create maximum psychological impact rather than strategic advantage." "Then we need to demonstrate the cost of murdering innocent civilians," Marcus replied. His voice carried harmonics that resonated through the ship's communication systems, reaching every member of the crew simultaneously. "Zhirin, what's the status of our new weapons development program?" "The prototype reality anchors are ready for field testing," the engineer replied, his enhanced cognitive systems displaying technical specifications directly into the shared awareness that linked the command crew. The Drakmori provided the theoretical framework, but our human tactical approaches have improved their practical application significantly. Marcus nodded, studying the weapon specifications through his neural interface. Reality anchors were devices that could temporarily stabilize the quantum foam of spacetime, preventing enemies from using dimensional phase technologies or temporal manipulation tactics. They represented a fusion of human military doctrine with ancient Drakmori physics that created capabilities neither species could have achieved alone. Deploy them against the Krillian Third Fleet, he ordered. But remember our rules of engagement. Target military installations and combat vessels only. Any ship that surrenders receives safe passage to neutral territory. The other Liberation commanders are requesting permission to respond more aggressively, Vex-High noted. The massacre of civilian populations has created significant pressure for retaliatory strikes against Krillian civilian targets. Denied, Marcus said firmly. We don't win this war by becoming the monsters we're fighting against. Every civilian we protect, every prisoner we treat with dignity, every mercy we show to defeated enemies becomes proof that our way is better than theirs. This had been the central challenge of his command. The beings who comprise the Liberation Fleet had all suffered under the current galactic order, many for centuries or millennia. Their desire for revenge was both understandable and dangerous. Marcus's role was not just to coordinate military operations, but to channel that anger into constructive change rather than simple destruction. The Drakmori Council is requesting a strategic conference, announced Tavarin, a Nethys collective consciousness that existed as patterns of organized energy rather than solid matter. They believe the time has come to reveal the full scope of our capabilities to the galactic powers. For months, the Liberation Fleet had been holding back its most advanced technologies, using only enough power to achieve tactical objectives without revealing the true extent of their capabilities. The strategy had been effective in preventing the current powers from developing effective countermeasures, but it had also limited their ability to prevent atrocities like the recent civilian massacres. What specifically are they proposing? He asked. Tavarin's energy pattern shifted into configurations that conveyed complex strategic concepts directly to Marcus's enhanced consciousness. A demonstration of our dimensional warfare capabilities against the Zephyrian Imperial Navy. Complete elimination of their primary battle fleet in a single engagement, using tactics they cannot comprehend or counter.
Casualties? Potentially minimal, Vex-High interjected, her tactical systems analyzing the proposed operation in real time.
If we coordinate the dimensional strikes with reality anchor deployments, we can disable their vessels without destroying them. The crews would be captured rather than killed. A decisive demonstration of superior force could potentially end the war months or even years sooner, preventing the massive casualties that would result from prolonged conflict. But it would also represent an escalation that could drive the current powers to even more desperate measures. Through the ship's sensors, he could perceive the approach of a Drakmori vessel that existed primarily in dimensions beyond normal spacetime. Its arrival created ripples in quantum foam that his enhanced senses could detect long before conventional sensors registered its presence. The massive ship materialized alongside the Prometheus Rising like a mountain of crystallized shadow, its form shifting between states of matter as it stabilized in normal space. They're here for an answer, Tavarin observed. The Council believes that further delay will only result in more civilian casualties as the galactic powers grow increasingly desperate. Marcus moved to the communication station, opening a direct channel to the Drakmori vessel. The connection was not simply electronic, but involved a merging of consciousness that allowed for communication at levels beyond simple language. Through it, he could perceive the ancient beings who comprised the Council. Their vast intelligence focused on calculations that span geological timescales. "We have considered your proposal," he transmitted. "But before we proceed with such an escalation, I need to understand the long-term consequences. What happens to galactic civilization after we demonstrate this level of technological superiority?" The response came not as words, but as a cascade of images and concepts that painted a picture of potential futures. Marcus saw possibilities ranging from peaceful transition to new forms of governance to total societal collapse as existing power structures proved unable to adapt to radically changed circumstances. The risks are significant, admitted Elder Nick Thule, the Council's primary strategic coordinator. But the alternative is a prolonged conflict that will devastate entire sectors and potentially destroy the very civilizations we seek to liberate.
There is another consideration, added Elder Vorash, whose consciousness specialized in temporal analysis.
Intelligence gathered from captured facilities suggests that the current powers are developing weapons of mass extinction. Devices designed to eliminate entire species rather than simply defeat them militarily. The window for decisive action is narrowing. Marcus absorbed this information, his enhanced cognitive systems analyzing the implications at superhuman speed. The galactic powers were escalating toward genocidal tactics, which meant that mercy and restraint might no longer be viable options. The choice was becoming not whether to reveal their full capabilities, but when and how to deploy them for maximum strategic effect. If we proceed with the demonstration, he asked, what assurances do I have that the galactic powers will interpret it as an offer to negotiate rather than a prelude to their complete destruction? That depends largely on how the demonstration is conducted, Elder Nick Thule replied. If it is presented as an ultimatum backed by overwhelming force, they may choose negotiation. If it is perceived as the beginning of a campaign of extermination, they will likely resort to their most desperate measures. Marcus thought of Earth, of the billions who had died when humanity had been deemed too dangerous to permit continued existence. The galactic powers had shown no mercy to his people when they held the advantage. Now that the situation was reversed, the question became whether mercy was wisdom or weakness. The key variable is you, Marcus Chen, Elder Vorash observed. The galactic powers understand force and fear, but they also respect strength that is tempered by principle. If the demonstration comes with your personal guarantee that surrender will be accepted and civilian populations protected, they may believe it. And if they don't, then we proceed to Phase 2 of the Liberation Protocol, Elder Nixatul replied grimly. Complete dismantling of the current galactic order and reconstruction from fundamental principles. The casualties would be enormous, but the long-term survival of galactic civilization would be assured. Marcus made his decision with the clarity that came from enhanced human intuition combined with access to probability matrices beyond normal comprehension. We proceed with the demonstration, but we do it my way, with human standards for the treatment of prisoners and clear terms for negotiation offered simultaneously with the display of force. Acceptable. The Council replied in unison. Prepare your fleet for dimensional translation to the Zephyrian Imperial Naval Base at Proxima Centauri. The demonstration will commence in 72 standard hours. As the communication link closed, Marcus turned to address his command crew. Alert all fleet commanders. We're about to show the galaxy what humans were meant to become. Make sure every vessel understands that this is not just a military operation. It's the foundation of whatever comes after. The preparations began immediately. Throughout the Liberation Fleet, vessels that had been operating at partial capacity began revealing their true capabilities. Reality anchors powered up to full operational status. Dimensional phase generators came online. Weapons that existed partially outside normal space-time were loaded and targeted. But more importantly, the enhanced beings who comprised the fleet's command structure began coordinating their consciousness in ways that the galactic powers had never encountered. Human tactical innovation merged with Drakmori ancient wisdom. Taraxian strategic analysis combined with Vroth technological expertise. Nethys psionic abilities integrated with capabilities that existed beyond any single species' understanding. They were no longer simply an alliance of liberated prisoners and suppressed races. They had become something entirely new, a synthesis of the galaxy's greatest potential operating in service of principles that transcended the narrow interests of any single civilization. Dimensional translation commencing in 60 seconds. Zhren announced. Marcus took his position at the fleet command station, his consciousness merging with the tactical networks that linked every vessel in the armada. Through enhanced senses that spanned multiple dimensions, he could perceive the target system ahead, the massive concentration of Zephyrian naval power that represented the core of their military might. "All vessels, this is Admiral Chen," he transmitted across frequencies that reached every consciousness in the fleet. "Remember why we fight. Not for revenge, not for conquest, but for the chance to build something better. Show them what the galaxy can become." The Liberation fleet translated into normal space at the edge of the Proxima Centauri system in a display of coordinated precision that defied every known law of fleet movement. One moment the system contained only the Zephyrian Imperial Navy, the next it was surrounded by vessels that seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, their forms shifting between states of matter as they operated according to principles of physics that the Empire's scientists had never discovered. The demonstration lasted exactly 17 minutes. When it was over, the entire Zephyrian Third Fleet had been disabled and its crews safely evacuated to neutral vessels. Not a single life had been lost, but the message was unmistakable. The old order was over, and the future belonged to those willing to embrace change. Marcus Chen, the last human, had kept his promise to his species. He had shown the galaxy what humanity was meant to become, and in doing so, he had opened the door to possibilities that would reshape civilization itself. The real work was just beginning.